The night pressed down on the Dakota Territory, 1874-1875, like a predator's paw, heavy and patient. Dakota crouched by his fire, turning the rabbit on its spit, with hands that had known this work since childhood. The sandstone cliffs behind him caught the firelight and threw it back in streaks of copper and shadow, their ancient faces watching without judgment. His bow rested against his thigh, the wood worn smooth by years of use. His Winchester Model 1873 lay within easy reach, the metal still warm from proximity to the flames. And his knife, always his knife, hung at his belt, where his fingers could find it in darkness or daylight, in peace or in violence. He was 24 years old and had been alone for nearly 4 years, not by choice, by consequence, by shame that sat in his chest like a stone he could neither swallow nor spit out. The scar on his left shoulder burned in the cold air, 3 parallel lines where the cavalry whip had cut deep, the leather biting through skin and muscle until bone showed white. But that pain was nothing. The memory that came with it was everything. His sister's screams as the soldiers tied her to the post, her thin back already bearing 2 lashes and the skin split and weeping. The sound she made when the 3rd strike fell, not a scream anymore, but something worse. Something broken. She had been 12 years old. Her crime stealing a sack of flour from a settler's wagon to feed their family through a winter that had already taken 2 of the elders and a baby cousin. Dakota had been 16, already considered a man, and he had lunged forward without thinking, his voice cracking as he shouted for them to stop. The soldiers had smiled then, those hard white smiles that said they had been waiting for an excuse. They had tied him beside her and given him the last 3 lashes meant for her, plus 2 more for his insolence. 5 strikes. His sister had screamed herself hoarse, trying to beg them to stop. He had bitten his tongue until blood filled his mouth, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing his pain. That had been the beginning. But the end, and the reason he lived alone now, stood not by decree, but by the weight of his own failure, had come 2 years later, and it was a wound that would never heal. He pushed the memory away, as he always did, but it clung to him like smoke. His nephew's face, young, eager, full of the kind of courage that comes from not yet understanding what the world can take from you. The raid the young men had planned a chance to prove themselves, to take horses from the white settlers who kept pushing further into Lakota land, to show the elders they were warriors worthy of respect. Dakota had argued against it. He had stood before the fire and spoken of consequences of the cavalry that would come in retaliation of the women and children who would pay the price for young men's pride. They had called him a coward. They had said he had let the white man's whip break his spirit. His nephew, his sister's son, the boy he had helped raise, had looked at him with eyes full of disappointment and said, "I thought you were brave, Uncle. I thought you understood what it means to be Lakota." Those words had cut deeper than any whip. They had gone anyway. 10 young men, including his nephew, riding out at dawn with fresh paint on their faces and songs on their lips. The cavalry had been waiting a trap, some said later intelligence provided by a Crow scout with old grudges. The fight had been brief and brutal. 3 young men returned, 2 of them wounded. 7 did not return at all. His nephew's body had been left on the prairie for the Crows, along with the others. By the time the band could safely retrieve them, 3 days had passed. Dakota had been the one to wrap his nephew's remains in buffalo hide, had seen what the elements and scavengers had done, had felt his sister collapse against him, her grief a sound that had no words. She had not blamed him aloud. No one had. But he had seen it in their eyes, the question they were all thinking: if you had been there, if you had gone with them, would he still be alive? Dakota did not know the answer. But the not knowing was its own kind of hell. He had left the band that same day, taking only his weapons, a blanket, and the crushing weight of his failure. He told himself it was temporary, that he would return when he had proven something. To them, to himself. But 4 years had passed, and he still did not know what that proof should look like. So he lived between worlds, guiding the occasional traveler who paid in coin or goods, gathering herbs that he traded with the few white doctors who would deal with him, hunting game that he sometimes gave to struggling settler families if their children looked too thin. He spoke to almost no one. He made camp alone. He woke alone. And he had made himself a promise, kneeling beside his sister as she wept over her son's wrapped body. No one would starve within reach of his hand. No one would die alone if he could prevent it. It would not bring his nephew back. It would not erase his failure. But it was something. A small attempt at balance in a world that seemed designed to tip toward cruelty. That promise was why, when he heard the footsteps, uneven, stumbling, desperate, his hand moved not to his weapon, but to the knife ready to cut another portion of meat. The figure that staggered into his firelight looked more like a ghost than a living woman. Her dress hung in ruins, the fabric that might once have been pale blue now stained so dark with mud and salt and old blood that it looked black in places. Her face was a study in starvation, cheekbones sharp enough to cut lips, cracked and bleeding eyes, too large in their sockets, glassy with fever or exhaustion or both. Her hair brown and matted with dust, and bits of dried grass hung around her face in tangles that spoke of days, maybe weeks, without care. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Blue, he saw, though, bloodshot and rimmed with red. And in them, beneath the exhaustion and fear, was something else. A kind of desperate determination. The look of someone who had decided they would take one more step, and then one more, and then one more, until either they reached safety or they fell and did not rise. She did not look at him. Not at first. Her gaze fixed on the rabbit roasting over the fire with an intensity that was almost frightening in its nakedness. Her throat worked, trying to swallow with a mouth too dry. Her hands trembled at her sides. When she spoke, her voice was barely more than a rasp, thick with an accent he recognized. French, he thought, though he had only heard it a handful of times from trappers and traders. "Please," she whispered, and the words seemed to cost her everything. Just one bite. Please." Dakota remained motionless, every instinct that had kept him alive on the frontier screaming warnings. No one traveled the Dakota territory alone without powerful reasons, and those reasons were rarely good. Settler women did not wander the wilderness without wagons, without men, without supplies. She could be bait for a trap. She could be diseased. She could be mad. But she could also be what she appeared to be, a woman, at the absolute end of her strength, minutes or hours from death, asking for the only thing that stood between her and the grave. Her knees buckled. She caught herself against a boulder with a small broken sound, and her whole body trembled with the effort of staying upright. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. Her eyes never left the meat. Dakota made his decision. He rose fluidly. A lifetime of hunting had taught him to move without wasted motion, and cut a generous strip of meat from the rabbit. The knife moved with practiced precision, and he held the meat over the flames for a few moments, turning it, letting the surface cool enough that it would not burn her mouth. Then he approached her slowly, the way one approaches a wounded deer that might bolt or attack in its panic. "Take," he said quietly, his English deliberate and careful. He did not use the language often, and it felt awkward in his mouth, the sounds not quite sitting right on his tongue. "Is good. You eat." Her hand shook so violently as she reached out that he thought she might drop the meat. Their fingers brushed hers ice cold despite the lingering warmth of the day, rough with blisters that had burst and healed and burst, again the skin of someone who had been doing hard labor or walking much too far. His were warm, calloused from bow and knife and rope steady. For a heartbeat their eyes met. Hers were blue, a pale blue like winter ice, though rimmed with red from exhaustion or crying or the grit of prairie dust. Wide with fear and hope, and something he recognized, the desperate gratitude of someone who had been shown unexpected mercy. She snatched the meat from his hand and tore into it with her teeth, a sound escaping her throat that was half sob, half moan of pure relief. She chewed with her eyes closed, grease running down her chin, her whole body shaking. She swallowed, and her eyes opened, already moving back to his hand, as if checking whether there might be more. Lakota stepped back, giving her space, and watched her carefully. He had seen starvation before, starvation. Had seen it in his own people during the hard winters, had seen it in settler children whose parents had brought them west with more hope than sense. He knew the signs and the sunken eyes and the way the skin pulled tight over bones, the tremor in the hands that came from a body consuming itself to stay alive. When she swallowed the last of the meat, he offered his water skin. She reached for it with both hands, clutching it like a lifeline, and drank too fast. The water hit her empty stomach, and she coughed, choking, and he pulled the skin back gently. Slow. He said, his accent making the words sound almost like two syllables. You drink slow? Too fast you be sick. She nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, and he let her have the water skin again. This time she drank more carefully, small sips, though he could see the effort it took to restrain herself. When she lowered the skin, tears were tracking clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. Thank you, she breathed, and her voice broke on the words. Thank you. I thought. The crack of a rifle shattered the night. The bullet struck the spit, sending the rabbit tumbling into the coals in an explosion of sparks and ash. Lakota's reflexes were instantaneous, honed by years of hunting and being hunted by the knowledge that hesitation meant death. He grabbed the woman's arm and yanked her behind the nearest boulder, his body covering hers, pressing her down into the dirt as a second shot rang out. This one struck the sandstone above their heads, and chips of rock rained down on them, stinging where they hit bare skin. Not move? He hissed in her ear, his hand pressing her shoulder down, holding her flat. Stay down. No sound. She was pressed against the rock, breathing in short, panicked gasps, her whole body rigid with terror. Lakota lifted his head fractionally, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's dying light, with the focused intensity of a predator. West Ridge. He could see the faint silhouettes against the stars, 2, maybe 3 figures. 100 yards out, perhaps, slightly less. They had good rifles, good positions. They had been waiting for the woman to reach the fire before they opened up, which meant they had been tracking her specifically. They wanted her alive, or they would have shot her already. A voice boomed across the rocks, harsh and confident, carrying the flat vowels of Missouri or Kansas, a white man who had spent years shouting orders and expecting obedience. Hand over the woman and the box, Indian. Do that nice and peaceful, and we ride on. No need for more trouble. Lakota said nothing. His mind was already calculating distance cover, wind direction, and the position of his horse tethered in the willows. He had no idea what box the man meant, but it did not matter. What mattered was that men with rifles were hunting this woman, and they were willing to shoot through him to get to her. He glanced down at the woman. Her eyes were wide white, showing all around the pale blue, and her lips were moving in silent denial. She was shaking her head fractionally over and over. I do not... She started to whisper, but another shot cut her off. This one striking the ground near the scattered coals of the fire, sending up a spray of dirt and embers. Last chance, the voice roared. The woman and the box, or we come down there and take them over your dead body. Your choice, Indian. Lakota did not waste breath on answers. Words would not save them now. He kicked dirt over what remained of the fire, with his foot plunging them into darkness, then grabbed his rifle with one hand and the woman's wrist with the other. She stumbled as he pulled her toward the line of willows at the creek's edge, her torn dress catching on stones and sage. Behind them, he heard the rattle of tack and the thud of hooves. The riders had been waiting for darkness, and now they were coming. "Run," he said, pulling her forward. "Follow water, not stop. You understand? Not stop." She ran, or tried to. Her legs barely held her, her feet wrapped in what looked like strips of cloth that were more blood than fabric. But fear gave her a strength she did not know she still possessed. Lakota kept pace beside her, half dragging her, when she stumbled, his free hand, holding his rifle ready as ears, tracking the sound of pursuit behind them. They hit the willows, and he pulled her down into the shallow creek. The shock of cold water made her gasp a sharp, indrawn breath that might have become a cry if he had not put his hand over her mouth. "Quiet," he breathed. "They listen for sound." She nodded against his hand, and he released her, taking her arm instead and pulling her downstream. The water was knee-deep here, flowing fast over smooth stones that made treacherous footing. He could hear the riders hitting the camp, now shouts, the sound of boots hitting ground. Someone cursing as they scattered the remains of his supplies, looking for what they had come for. Behind them, torches flared to life, throwing wild shadows across the creek bank. Lakota pulled the woman deeper into the willows, the branches scratching at their faces, catching in her hair. A bullet hissed past his ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it, close enough that he heard the sound it made, cutting the air. A sound he had heard too many times before. He gritted his teeth and moved faster, his hand locked around her wrist, feeling her pulse racing under his fingers. They ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until the woman's legs finally gave out completely, and she collapsed against a cottonwood trunk, sliding down until she sat in a heap at its base. Her breathing was ragged, hitching on the edge of hyperventilating. Lakota crouched beside her, listening to the night, his rifle ready. They were in a narrow canyon now, red stone walls rising on either side, a place he had used before when he needed to disappear. Defensible if it came to that. Hidden if they were careful. After several minutes of silence, no sound of hooves, no voices, no torches, he allowed himself to assess their situation. The woman was in bad shape, worse than he had first thought. Now that they were away from the firelight, he could see her more clearly in the moonlight. Her dress was not just torn, it was ruined, the fabric stiff with old blood and mud and what might have been salt. Her feet were wrapped in strips that looked like they had been cut from a petticoat, and they were soaked through with blood. Her hands were blistered and torn. A graze across her forearm was red and angry, probably from a rock rather than a bullet, but infected nonetheless. He pulled out his own shirt and tore another strip from the hem, and then soaked it in water from his canteen and cleaned the wound on her arm as gently as he could. She flinched, but did not pull away her eyes, watching his hands with a kind of wary gratitude. You speak English," she said between gasps, her voice steadier now but still weak. She was studying him with new awareness, seeing past her own terror to really look at him for the first time. "Some," he said, not meeting her eyes, focusing on tying the bandage. "Not good. Not much." He paused, searching for words. "Traders teach me. Some missionary woman she tried teach me reading. Soldiers..." His jaw tightened. "Soldiers teach me curse words." She made a sound that might have been a laugh if she had more strength. "You speak well enough. Is work. English is..." He struggled for the word. "Strange. Sounds not right." He finished tying the bandage and sat back on his heels. "You heard other places." She shook her head, then hesitated. "My feet. They are bad. I look..." She nodded, and he carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandages around her feet. What he found made his jaw tighten. blisters that had burst and been walked on until the raw flesh beneath had started to bleed. Some were trying to heal, but had dirt ground into them. It was a miracle she had been able to walk at all. He dug into his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch, his medicine bag, one of the few things he had taken from his old life. Inside were dried yarrow leaves, sage, and a few other herbs his grandmother had taught him to use before the soldiers had burned her lodge, and called her healing knowledge witchcraft. He crushed some of the yarrow with a little water from his canteen, making a paste, and applied it to the worst of the wounds on her feet. She gasped at the sting, but held still. "This help," he said. "Stop infection. Make healing." He bound her feet with clean strips from his shirt, using the last of the fabric. He would be cold tonight, but she would be less likely to die of fever. "You walk 3 days like this. From Ghost Hollow?" She said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a flood. 3 days ago, maybe 4. I have lost track of time." Her hands twisted in her lap. "The whole town, it was just gone. The water came like thunder-black water, roaring so loud I could not hear the screaming, but I could see mouths open, people reaching." Her voice broke. "I was in the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was on higher ground. I saw it coming and I ran, and I kept running." Dakota finished bandaging her feet and settled back against the canyon wall across from her. He studied her face in the moonlight, the way her jaw trembled, the way she kept swallowing, as if trying to keep the memories from rising. "You run well," he said. "You live. Many do not. I should have." She stopped, shook her head. "The children. Some of the children were in the school with me. I tried to get them all out, but there was not enough time, and the water came so fast." "You live," Dakota repeated more firmly. "The dead, they do not need you feel bad. Living need you. You understand, you live, that is what you do. That is only thing you do." She looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face, as if trying to determine whether he was being kind or cruel. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "My name is Eliza," she said. "Eliza Marceline. Dakota." He pronounced it slowly, carefully, watching to see if she would mangle it the way most whites did. Dakota, or Dakota, or sometimes insultingly, the Coda. "Dakota," she repeated, and her French accent made it sound softer, the O rounder, but she got it essentially right. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "Not yet. They come at dawn. They hunt you. They want—" He paused. "They say you have box. What is this box?" Eliza's hand went to her pocket, a gesture so automatic she did not seem to realize she was doing it. She pulled out a small object and held it in her palm. In the moonlight, Dakota could see it was a music box, dented and scratched, the paint chipped away in places. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, a tiny ballerina on a spring wobbled drunkenly, and when she wound the key, the mechanism tried to play, but produced only a broken, discordant sound. "The children gave this to me," she said softly, her thumb brushing over the damaged surface. "When I first came to Ghost Hollow, I sang for them at the school. French songs, English songs, whatever they wanted to hear. They loved music." Her voice wavered. "Before I was supposed to leave for another position, they gave me this as a farewell gift. It was not new even then. Someone's mother had given it up, I think. But they wrapped it so carefully, and they were so proud." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "It is all I have left of them. It is worthless. Why would anyone want this?" Dakota took the music box, carefully turning it over in his hands. It was cheap tin and painted wood, the kind of trinket sold in general stores for a few cents. The mechanism was broken, The ballerina's leg snapped. To anyone else, it would look like junk, something to be thrown away. But men with rifles did not hunt women across the territory for sentiment. They think is something else, he said slowly, handing it back to her. Or they think you know something. You see something. He met her eyes. You keep hide. We find out when we safe. She nodded and tucked the music box back into her pocket, her hand lingering over it protectively. They sat in silence for a time, both listening to the night sounds, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through sage, the trickle of water over stone. After a while, Eliza spoke again, her voice hesitant, almost shy. Why are you helping me, your people and mine? We are not friends. It was a question Lakota had been expecting, though, that did not make it easier to answer. He was silent for a long moment, staring up at the strip of stars, visible between the canyon walls, searching for words in a language that was not his own to explain things that had no easy explanation. My sister, he said finally, his voice low and rough. She was punished by soldiers, white soldiers. She take food flour, only flour for family, he struggled for the word, for survive winter. Soldiers say she steal. He touched his scarred shoulder. They whip her. She was 12 summers. 12. I try stop them. I tell them take me, punish me. So they whip me too. 5 times. He heard Eliza's sharp intake of breath, but he did not look at her. I make promise that day, he continued. No one starve when I can help. No one punished for want to live. No one die alone if I can stop this. He paused. Is not enough. Promise is not enough, but is something. That is a noble promise, Eliza said quietly. He shook his head. Is not noble. He searched for the word, could not find it. Is trying to balance, to make. He made a gesture with his hands like scales tipping. To make weight, same on both sides. Because of your nephew, Eliza said softly. His head snapped toward her, his eyes sharp. How you know? You haven't said it, but I hear it in your voice. In the way you said, not enough. Her expression was gentle understanding. You lost someone. Someone you could not save. Dakota's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly the words began to come halting, painful, like pulling thorns from old wounds. My nephew. My sister's son. He paused, struggling. 15 summers. Young. Want to be warrior. Want to prove he is brave, he is strong. Other young men they plan raid, take horses from settlers. I say no. I say soldiers come, bring guns, bring death to camp. Women, children, old ones, they pay price for young men's pride. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. They call me coward. He said the word bitter in his mouth. Say I break by white man's whip. Say I forget how to be Lakota. My nephew, Dakota's voice caught. He look at me. He say, I thought you were brave, uncle. I thought you understood. He closed his eyes. They go without me. Cavalry waiting. His trap. 7 young men not come back. My nephew. I find his body. 3 days later, I wrap him in buffalo hide. I carry him back. My sister. He shook his head, unable to continue. It was not your fault, Eliza said. I'm not there. And if you had been, you would be dead too. And you would not be here to help me. And I would be dead as well. She leaned forward slightly, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. You cannot carry guilt for someone else's choice. Your nephew chose to go. The men who killed him, they are the ones with blood on their hands. You not understand. I understand more than you think. Eliza interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. In France, after the revolution, There was chaos, violence. My parents sent me to live with my aunt in Paris because they thought I would be safer there. My younger brother stayed with them. I begged to stay too, but they said no. Her hands twisted in her lap. 6 months later, there was an outbreak of cholera in our village. My brother died. He was 8 years old. She looked up at Dakota, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For years I thought if I had been there, if I had insisted on staying, maybe I could have helped nurse him. Maybe he would have lived. But the truth is, if I had been there, I probably would have caught cholera too. I probably would have died. And then my parents would have lost both of us. She wiped at her eyes. Guilt is a heavy thing, Dakota. But sometimes we carry it for burdens that are not ours to bear. Dakota stared at her, this strange white woman with her French accent, and her torn dress and her feet wrapped in bloody rags, and felt something shift in his chest. A wall he had built brick by careful brick beginning to crack. You are... He searched for the word. Wise. For one so? Young. She managed a small smile. I am 23, old enough to have learned that the world is cruel and that kindness is rare. She met his eyes. Thank you, Dakota, for your kindness. He nodded slowly, then rose and moved to the canyon entrance, checking the darkness for signs of pursuit. After a moment, he returned and settled near her close enough to share warmth in the cooling night, far enough to be respectful of the invisible boundaries between them. You rest now, he said. I keep watch. Dawn comes soon. We must go. Where? She asked. Dry Cedar. Trading post 2 days walk. Maybe 3 with... He gestured at her feet. Maybe there is someone who help. Maybe we find out why men hunt you. 2 days, she repeated, and he heard the despair in her voice. I do not know if I can... You can, he said firmly. You walk 3 days already alone with no food, no water, feet like that. You can walk 2 more. I make sure of this. I help you. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something change in her expression and the fear receding slightly, replaced by the fragile beginning of trust. All right, she said. 2 days. Together. Together, he agreed. And somewhere in the darkness far behind them, the hunters were regrouping, following their trail patient and relentless. They walked through country that grew more broken with each mile land, carved by ancient waters, into gullies and ravines studded with juniper and sage, that gave off their sharp, clean scents in the heat. The sun was merciless, and even though Dakota had given Eliza his hat, her face was soon burned and peeling. Her feet, despite the bandages and yarrow paste, left small spots of blood on the rocks. But she did not complain. She had learned quickly that out here complaining did no good. It only wasted breath you could not spare. Dakota set a pace that was as fast as he dared, slow enough that Eliza could keep up, fast enough that they might stay ahead of pursuit. He did not speak much during the walking, saving his breath and attention for watching the land, reading it, for signs, disturbed stones, that might mean riders had passed broken twigs, that might indicate someone had hidden in the brush the direction of bird flight, that might reveal approaching danger. But during their brief rests in the shade of rock overhangs or in the lee of boulders, they began to talk. Eliza told him more about her life before Ghost Hollow, how she had left France, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few coins sewn into her hem. How she had worked in kitchens and laundries in New York, saving every penny. How she had heard about teaching positions out west and had thought it sounded like an adventure, a new beginning in a new world. I thought I would teach children to read and write and sing, she said with a bitter laugh. I thought I would help build something. Instead, I watched children drown. Dakota listened without offering platitudes. He knew there were no words that could make that kind of pain smaller. In turn, he told her about his grandmother, who had taught him the names of plants and how to use them, which ones stopped bleeding, which ones brought down fever, which ones could ease pain or help a woman in childbirth. He told her about learning to hunt, about the first time he had brought down a deer and how proud his father had been. He did not tell her that his father had died 2 winters later, frozen in a blizzard while hunting, or that his mother had followed within the year, her heart simply giving up from grief and hardship. Some wounds were too deep to share with someone he had known less than a day. By late afternoon on their second day of walking, they reached Knife Spur, a narrow saddle of land squeezed between 2 towering cliffs of bone-white stone. The wind howled through the gap, throwing dust and grit into their faces, tugging at their clothes. Lakota moved cautiously, his rifle ready, his eyes constantly scanning the high ground. This was perfect ambush country, high rocks, multiple vantage points, limited escape routes. They were halfway across the saddle when he froze his hand, shooting up in warning. Eliza stopped immediately, her heart leaping into her throat. Ahead, coiled on a flat rock in a patch of sunlight, was a rattlesnake as thick as a man's wrist. Its tail vibrated with that distinctive dry rattle, a sound that seemed to bypass the brain and speak directly to some ancient primal fear in the human heart. Lakota knelt, slowly moving with infinite care, and reached for a stick to prod the snake aside. The crack of a rifle split the air. The bullet struck the rock inches from the snake, sending shards of stone and a cloud of dust into the air. The rattlesnake vanished into a crevice with liquid speed, and Lakota grabbed Eliza's arm, yanking her down as a second shot rang out. This one struck the ground where she had been standing a moment before. They tumbled sideways, sliding down a slope of loose shale and scree. Eliza felt her thigh scrape against something sharp, a jagged edge of rock protruding from the slope, and pain exploded through her leg. She cried out, clutching at the wound, and felt something warm and wet seeping between her fingers. Blood. Too much blood. Lakota pulled her behind a boulder, both of them gasping, and immediately his hands were on her leg, assessing the damage. The gash was deep, running from mid-thigh, almost to her knee, bleeding freely. Not arterial. If it had been arterial, she would already be losing consciousness, but bad enough. "Hold still," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It hurts." She gasped and hated herself for saying it, for the weakness in her voice. I know it hurt. But you will be good. I help you." His hands were already moving, tearing another strip from his shirt. He was running out of fabric, would be bare-chested soon if this kept up, and folding it into a pad. "You press here. Hard. You understand? Press hard." She nodded and pressed her hands over the wound, biting her lip against the pain. Blood soaked through the fabric almost immediately. Lakota pulled out his medicine pouch again and crushed yarrow leaves between his fingers, mixing them with water to form a paste. His movements were quick but precise, the muscle memory of someone who had done this many times before. "This will sting," he warned, and applied the paste directly to the wound. It did more than sting. It burned like fire, and Eliza bit down on her own hand to keep from screaming. Above them, she could hear voices, the hunters calling to each other, coordinating their approach. Lakota worked quickly, wrapping the bandage tight enough to stop the bleeding, but not so tight it would cut off circulation. His hands were surprisingly gentle despite the urgency, and when he looked up at her, checking her face for signs of shock, their eyes met and held. "You will be all right," he said quietly, and something in his voice made it feel less like a reassurance and more like a promise, like a vow. "I not let you die here. I not let them take you." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and he helped her to her feet. She tried to put weight on the injured leg and nearly fell. but his arm was there, strong and steady, holding her up. Above them, 3 riders were picking their way down the slope, rifles at the ready, moving with the practiced caution of men who had hunted dangerous game before. Lakota counted them quickly, calculated odds, and made his decision. "We cannot run from them here," he said. "Ground is bad, you are hurt. We fight or we die." Eliza's hand found the small knife at her belt. Barely more than a letter opener, really. Something she had taken from the schoolhouse in her panicked flight, but it was something. She met his eyes, saw her own fear reflected there, and beneath it, a determination that steadied her. "Then we fight," she said, and her voice was stronger than she felt. Lakota positioned her behind the boulder, giving her the best cover, and handed her his rifle. He showed her again how to hold it, how to aim his hands, guiding hers with patient precision despite the approaching danger. "Cheek here," he murmured, tapping the stock. "Look down here. Breathe slow. When ready, squeeze, not pull. Squeeze like—" He made a gentle gesture with his hand. Their shoulders were pressed together, his body warm and solid beside hers. She could smell sage and smoke and leather on him, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. For a moment, just a moment, the fear receded, replaced by a strange sense of calm, of rightness, as if this was where she was supposed to be, impossible as that seemed. "I understand," she said. "Good." He took his bow, nocked an arrow, and waited. The riders spread out, covering each other's approach with the precision of experienced fighters. They were 50 yards away. 40. 30. "Now," Lakota whispered. Eliza squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, harder than she had expected, and the shot went wide, striking rock above the nearest rider's head. But the noise startled his horse, sending it rearing and plunging. The rider cursed, fighting for control. Lakota's arrow flew the string, releasing with a musical twang that was somehow beautiful, even in the midst of violence. The arrow struck the brim of another rider's hat, missing his skull by inches, and sent the hat spinning through the air. The man ducked reflexively, his own rifle shot going wild. In the moment of chaos and confusion, Lakota grabbed Eliza's hand and pulled her through a narrow cleft in the rocks, a gap he had spotted on their way up, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. They ran limping, stumbling, the sound of gunfire, and shouted curses echoing off the stone walls behind them. They did not stop until the canyon walls opened onto a stretch of scrubland dotted with juniper and twisted mesquite. Lakota pushed Eliza down into a dry wash, a seasonal creek bed, bone dry now in late summer, and covered her with branches and dead grass. "Do not move," he said, his breath coming fast. "Do not make sound. I go back, make them think we go different way." "No." She started grabbing his arm. "I come back," he said firmly. "I promise. But if they follow right trail, they catch us. You too slow now with leg. I need to—" He struggled for the word. "To trick them. Make false trail, you understand?" She wanted to argue, wanted to say she could keep going, wanted to say she was not afraid to die if it meant he did not have to risk himself. But she looked at his face, at the determination there, at the fierce protectiveness, and realized that arguing would be an insult to both of them. "I understand," she said. "But if you do not come back, I will be very angry." He smiled then. A quick flash of white teeth that transformed his face for a moment made him look younger. "Then I come back. I not want you be angry." And he was gone, melting into the scrubland like a shadow, leaving her alone in the dry wash, with her racing heart and bleeding leg, and the sound of her own breathing too loud in her ears. She waited. Minutes stretched like hours. The sun beat down, and the smell of her own blood, copper and salt mixed with the dusty scent of dry earth and sage. She could hear the hunters in the distance, their voices echoing strangely off the rocks, but she could not tell if they were getting closer or farther away. A lizard skittered across the wash near her head, its scales catching the light. Somewhere, a hawk cried out, riding the thermal currents high above. The normal sounds of the prairie continuing, as if men hunting other men for murder was nothing unusual, nothing worth remarking on. Eliza found herself thinking about the music box in her pocket, about the children who had given it to her. Emma, who had been 7 and had a gap in her front teeth from losing a baby tooth just before the presentation. Thomas, who was 10 and serious, who had saved his pennies for months to contribute to the purchase. Little Marie, only 5, who had insisted on wrapping it herself even though the paper had ended up more crumpled than neat. Were they alive, dead? She did not know. After the water had come, after she had run, she had not gone back, had not looked back. She had just run and run and run until her legs gave out, and then she had crawled, and then she had staggered to her feet and run some more. Coward, a voice in her head whispered. You ran and left them. But another voice, one that sounded oddly like Dakota's careful English, answered, You live. That is what you do. That is only thing you do. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the sound of footsteps, not the careful tread of Dakota returning, but the heavier sound of boots on stone. Someone was approaching the wash. Eliza's hand closed around her knife, and she held her breath, every muscle in her body tensing. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the wash, right above where she lay hidden. A long silence. Then a man's voice, unfamiliar, speaking to someone else. Nothing here, just rocks and sage. They must have gone the other way. Hollis said they came this direction. Another voice answered, younger, less certain. Hollis says a lot of things. Doesn't mean they're all true. Come on, we're wasting time. The footsteps moved away. Eliza remained frozen, barely breathing for what felt like an eternity. And then finally, Dakota was there, his hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. They go. Is safe now. Come. She nearly sobbed with relief. They walked until full dark, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the hunters. When Dakota finally allowed them to stop, it was in a small depression between 2 rocks, barely large enough for both of them, hidden from casual view. He would not risk a fire. He checked Eliza's bandage by moonlight, his fingers gentle on the fabric. The bleeding had stopped, but the skin around the wound was hot to the touch. Is fevered, he said, his voice troubled. Infection starting. What can we do? Eliza asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Out here with no proper medical supplies, with men hunting them, there was not much to be done. Yarrow helped, but he shook his head. You need rest. Clean water, good food, time to heal. He met her eyes. We not have these things. Then we keep moving, she said firmly, and hope we reach dry cedar before the infection gets worse. Is dangerous. Everything is dangerous, she interrupted. Staying here is dangerous. Moving is dangerous. At least if we are moving, we have a chance. He studied her face in the moonlight, and then nodded slowly. You are brave, he said. More brave than you know. Or more foolish, she said with a weak smile. Sometimes the same thing. They sat in silence for a while, close together in the small space sharing body heat as the desert night grew cold. After a time, Dakota spoke, his voice soft, almost hesitant. You ask why I help you. I tell you about my sister, about my nephew, but is not whole truth. Eliza turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on the stars overhead. When I leave my people, he continued, I think I never forgive myself. I think I carry shame until I die. Every day I wake up and I think, today should have been his day. He should be alive, not me. He paused. But then you come. You walk into my fire, and you are He struggled for words. You are dying, but you not give up. You walk 3 days alone. You ask for help, not demand. You have pride, but not too much pride to live. He finally looked at her. I help you, and I think maybe this is why I still here. Maybe I am not supposed to die with him. Maybe I am supposed to be here for this, for you. He shook his head. Is stupid, maybe. White god Lakota spirits, I not know who decide these things. But I think maybe my nephew would say, good uncle, you do good. And maybe that is worth something. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. It is worth something, she said softly. It is worth everything. And without thinking, without planning, she reached out and took his hand. He startled slightly at the touch, but he did not pull away. His fingers, rough and calloused, closed gently around hers. They fell asleep like that, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a hidden depression in the rocks, holding hands, like children afraid of the dark. The next day, Eliza's fever worsened. She tried to hide it, but Dakota could see it in the flush of her cheeks, in the glassy brightness of her eyes, in the way she stumbled more frequently. By midday, she was shaking despite the heat. They were still a full day from Dry Cedar, longer at their current pace. Dakota made a decision. He found a place where the rocks formed a natural shelter, a kind of small cave, and he made Eliza lie down. He took his rifle and his bow and went hunting, moving fast, desperate. He found a jackrabbit within an hour, quick, clean shot with an arrow, and brought it back. No fire, so he butchered it raw, cutting the meat into small pieces, and made Eliza eat some of it. She gagged at first, her stomach rebelling, but he was firm. You need strength, he said. Meat gives strength. You eat. She ate, forcing it down, and when she looked at him with gratitude and exhaustion and something else in her eyes, something warmer, he had to look away. He sat guard while she slept fitfully, her breathing harsh and labored. And he prayed to the spirits of his grandmother, to Wakan Tanka, to the Christian God the missionaries had tried to teach him about, to anyone who might be listening, that she would survive, that he would not fail again. They reached the river the following morning. Eliza was barely conscious, leaning heavily on Dakota, her feet moving more from instinct than awareness. The fever had her in its grip now, and she mumbled in French words Dakota could not understand, but that sounded like prayers or apologies. The river was choked with debris from upstream, broken furniture, shattered barrels, a child's slate with alphabet letters still faintly visible in chalk. The evidence of Ghost Hollow's destruction carried downstream by the flood. And there, camped on the bank, was a small group of survivors. Dakota called out, and a man in a dusty black coat emerged from the trees. His face was lined with exhaustion and grief, his beard streaked with gray. Dr. Josiah Whitlow, the man said, and then his eyes widened. Is that Miss Marceline Goodbye Thunder? We thought she was dead. More figures emerged, men, women, a few children, not many, a dozen at most from a town that had held nearly 200. Among them, Dakota recognized Ruth Hargreave, the schoolteacher, and a young miner named Owen Pike, his leg bandaged and his face pale with pain. Dr. Whitlow, Eliza managed to say, her voice slurred with fever. The children, did any of the children? Whitlow's face told her the answer before his words did. 3 survived, he said gently. Emma, Thomas, and Daniel. The others? He shook his head. Eliza's legs gave out completely. If Dakota had not been holding her, she would have fallen. As it was, he lowered her carefully to the ground, and Dr. Whitlow hurried forward with his medical bag. She is fevered, Dakota said. Wound on leg 2 days old. I use yarrow, but... You did well, Whitlow said, already examining the wound. His practiced hands moved quickly, efficiently. The yarrow likely saved her life. But she needs rest, clean bandages, and I have some laudanum that will help with the pain and fever. As Whitlow worked, Ruth Hargreave approached Dakota. She was a tall woman with iron-gray hair and a face that had probably been stern even before tragedy had etched deeper lines around her mouth. But her eyes, when they met his, were not hostile, merely assessing. "You are the one who brought her here," she said. It was not a question. "I find her," Dakota said carefully. "She asked for help. I help." "She's lucky you did." Ruth glanced at Eliza, then back at him. "Or perhaps you are lucky she found you. Sometimes we do not know which is which until later." Owen Pike limped forward on his makeshift crutch, his young face drawn with pain and anger. "Miss Marceline," he said, "I need to tell you something about the flood." But Eliza was barely conscious, her eyes rolling back as the laudanum took effect. Owen turned to Dakota instead. "I was at the sluice gates that morning," he said urgently, "checking the supports like I did every week, and I heard blasts, 3 of them timed close together. Dynamite. I know that sound like I know my own heartbeat. I have worked with blasting powder for 5 years. He clenched his fists. That flood was not an accident. Someone set charges. Someone murdered the whole town. The words fell into the small group like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and anger outward. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Pike." Ruth set her voice tight. "Words like that can get a man killed." "I know what I heard," Owen insisted. Dakota stepped forward. "Who profit from town die?" he asked bluntly. There was a long silence. Then Dr. Whitlow spoke, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Bartholomew Crane, mine owner. He controls half the claims in the territory and most of the businesses in Ghost Hollow. There had been problems. Workers demanding back pay. Questions about the mine's finances. Rumors that the operation was failing." He shook his head. "But to murder an entire town to cover it up, that is beyond reason." "Is it?" Owen demanded. "Crane's type, they see people as numbers in a ledger. Debts and assets and liabilities. If the debt was too great, if the workers knew too much, if the whole operation was going to collapse." He gestured sharply. "Easier to drown the problems than solve them." Dakota thought of the men hunting Eliza, of their desperation to find the box she supposedly had. A suspicion was forming in his mind, but before he could voice it, Ruth spoke. "We need to cross the river," she said firmly. "There is a ferry cable 2 miles downstream. If we can reach it, we can get to Dry Cedar by nightfall. There is a sheriff there and a telegraph office. We can send word of what happened here, get help from the territorial authorities." "Men hunt us," Dakota said. "Hunt her." He gestured to Eliza. "They want something she have. They follow." "Then we move fast," Ruth said, and there was steel in her voice. "Everyone gather what you can carry. We leave immediately." They reached the ferry cable by mid-afternoon. The cable hung slack across the river, the wooden platform long since washed away by the flood. The water below was brown and swift, carrying more debris, broken chairs, pieces of buildings, things that might once have been someone's treasures and were now just wreckage. Dr. Whitlow tested the cable first, pulling himself hand over hand across the span with agonizing slowness. When he reached the far side, he called back, "It holds. Come across one at a time." Ruth went next, her movement surprisingly strong for a woman her age, her jaw set with determination. Then the others, men, women, even the 3 surviving children, though they had to be guided carefully, their small hands gripping the cable with white-knuckled terror. Dakota waited until last, staying on the near bank with Eliza, who was barely conscious, and Owen Pike, who could not move quickly with his injured leg. They watched the others cross, counting them off one by one. And then from the ridge behind them came the sound Dakota had been dreading. Hoofbeats. He turned and saw them, 4 riders silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Even at this distance, he could see the lead rider's wide-brimmed hat, could sense the confidence in the way he sat his horse. Hollis Marek, the hunter who had been following them since the first night. "Go," Dakota said urgently, helping Eliza to her feet. "Now, fast as you can." "I cannot," she started. "You can. You must." He pushed her toward the cable. "Go." She grabbed the cable with both hands, the rough metal biting into her palms, already raw from their previous flight, and pulled herself onto it. Her feet found the empty air, her legs dangling over the swift water, and she began to move. Hand over hand, one pull at a time. Behind her, she heard a rifle crack. The bullet struck the water 10 feet to her left, sending up a plume of spray. She kept moving. Another shot, this one closer. And then the cable shifted, and she realized Dakota had climbed on behind her. His body pressed against her back, his chest against her shoulders, his arms reaching past hers to grip the cable. He was shielding her with his own body. "Keep moving," he murmured in her ear, his voice steady despite the danger, despite the bullets now whining past them. "One hand at a time. Do not stop. I am with you. I will not let you fall." They moved together, their bodies pressed close, their breathing synchronized. She could feel his heartbeat against her back, steady calm, impossibly calm, considering they were suspended over rushing water while men shot at them. Another bullet struck the cable support behind them with a metallic clang. The cable lurched, swaying wildly, and Eliza's grip slipped. She gasped, her legs flailing, and Dakota's arm hooked around her waist, holding her, his strength, the only thing keeping her from falling. "I have you," he said, his voice fierce in her ear. "I have you. Keep moving." Hand over hand, inch by agonizing inch. The water roared below them, brown and merciless. Her arms screamed with the effort, her wounded leg throbbing her fever, making the world tilt and spin. But Dakota's voice was in her ear, his presence solid against her back, and she kept moving. They were 3/4 of the way across when she heard Dakota's sharp intake of breath, felt him stiffen against her. She turned her head slightly and saw blood bright red against the brown fabric of his shirt spreading from a wound on his ribs. "You are hit," she gasped. "Keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. "Almost there." Her hands found a rhythm, right, left, right, left. And then suddenly there were hands grabbing her, pulling her onto solid ground. Dr. Whitlow and Ruth hauled her onto the bank, and a moment later, Dakota dropped beside her, his face gray with pain, blood streaming from a graze across his ribs. Eliza's hands flew to the wound, pressing her torn shawl against it, her medical knowledge non-existent, but her instincts sure. "You are hurt," she said, and her voice broke. "You should not have. You could have been killed." "But I not," he said, catching her wrist with his bloodied hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "And you live. You keep moving. That is what matters." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, with blood and river water and fear all around them, something passed between them that had no name, but felt like gravity, like 2 planets recognizing each other's pull. Then Owen Pike, who had managed to cross while they were distracted, called out, "They are trying to follow." Dakota looked back. One of Hollis's men had started onto the cable, was making his way across hand over hand, his rifle slung across his back. Dakota rose unsteadily to his feet, ignoring Dr. Whitlow's protests, and raised his rifle. He aimed not at the man, but at the anchor post on the far side, the wooden beam driven deep into the ground that held the cable taut. He fired once, twice. Wood splintered. The cable lurched. The third shot hit the base of the post, and it gave way with a crack like thunder. The cable went slack, and the man on it screamed as he fell, his body hitting the water and disappearing beneath the brown surface almost instantly. Hollis Marek stood on the far bank, his face twisted with rage, and raised his fist. "This is not over," he roared across the water. "You hear me, Indian? This is not over." But for now the river was between them, and for now that was enough. Dry Cedar was less a town and more an optimistic cluster of buildings huddled around a crossroads, a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the sheriff's office, which was nothing more than an adobe building with bars on the windows and a flag hanging limp in the still air. Sheriff Brand was a thick-necked man in his mid-40s with a drooping mustache and eyes that had the flat, affectless quality of someone who had seen too much and cared too little. He listened to Dr. Whitlow's story with his boots propped on his desk, his expression never changing. When Whitlow finished, Brand was silent for a long moment. Then he swung his boots down, leaned forward, and fixed his gaze on Eliza. "The woman stays here," he said flatly, "for her protection. I do not need—" Eliza started, but Brand raised his hand. "It is not a request, miss. You have men hunting you by your own admission. Men with guns. That makes you a danger to this town and everyone in it. You will stay in protective custody until we sort this out." "She has done nothing wrong," Dakota said, stepping forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his knife before he checked the motion. "She run from flood. That is all." Brand's eyes flicked to him with open contempt. "And you are trespassing Indian. We have laws against vagrancy in this territory. I suggest you move along before I decide to lock you up too, and we both know how that would end." The threat was clear. Dakota in a cell controlled by a white sheriff was Dakota as good as dead. Dr. Whitlow put a hand on Dakota's arm, a gentle warning. "Let me handle this," Whitlow said quietly. "I will talk to him, reason with him. You being here will only make it worse." Dakota knew he was right, but every instinct screamed against leaving Eliza here alone, vulnerable. He looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes, the way her hands twisted together, and felt something in his chest crack. "I not leave town," he said to her, his English rough with emotion. "I stay close, I promise." The deputy, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, took Eliza's arm not roughly but firmly and led her toward the single cell at the back of the office. As the cell door clanged shut, Dakota shrugged off his oilskin coat, one of his few possessions, and handed it to the deputy. "For her," he said. "Night is cold." The deputy looked uncertain, glanced at Brand, then shrugged, and tossed the coat through the bars. Eliza caught it, clutching it to her chest, and reached through the bars with one hand. Dakota stepped close, his own hand covering hers, their fingers interlacing through the cold iron. "Do not leave," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Dakota, do not leave me here." He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. "I not leave," he said quietly, fiercely. "I promise you, Eliza. I stay. I not leave." He meant it with every fiber of his being. But as he left the sheriff's office and stepped into the late afternoon sun, he could not shake the feeling that he had just made a promise he might not be able to keep. Night fell over Dry Cedar, and Dakota did not go far. He sat in the shadows across from the jail, his back against the wall of the general store, his rifle across his knees. The town was small enough that he could watch both the front door of the sheriff's office and the narrow alley that ran along the back. Owen Pike found him there near midnight, limping through the darkness with his makeshift crutch. "You are going to get her out, are you not?" Owen said without preamble, lowering himself to the ground with a grunt of pain. If I must, Dakota said. Good. Because I have been thinking. Owen's face was hard to read in the darkness, but his voice was serious. That flood was not an accident. Someone powerful wanted Ghost Hollow gone, powerful enough to order dynamite set, powerful enough to make it look natural. That kind of power does not stop at destroying a town. It stops at eliminating witnesses. You think Miss Marceline is witness? I think she has something, or knows something that someone wants buried. Owen leaned forward. What did those men who were chasing you say they wanted? What were their exact words? Dakota thought back to that first night, to Hollis's voice echoing across the rocks. Hand over the woman in the box, he quoted. That is what they say. A box, Owen repeated thoughtfully. What kind of box? Music box, small, broken. She say children give her as gift. Can I see it? Dakota hesitated. He did not fully trust Owen, did not fully trust anyone except Eliza herself at this point. But the young miner had been helpful, had shared his knowledge about the dynamite. And they needed allies. She have it, in her pocket, in cell. Then we need to see it, Owen said. Tonight, because I guarantee you Sheriff Brand is not holding her for her protection. Men like Brand do not protect people, they protect profits. Dakota studied Owen's face in the dim starlight. You think Brand is corrupt, bought on Crane's payroll? Owen's laugh was bitter. I would bet my other leg on it. Then why we ask him for help? Because Ruth thought there might still be honest lawmen out here. Owen's expression was grim. She was wrong. They sat in silence for a time, both watching the sheriff's office. Then Dakota spoke. You help me get Key? I will do better than that, Owen said. There are loose boards under that building. It is built on a crawl space. I saw them when we arrived. We can get underneath, listen to what is said inside. If Brand is planning something, we will know. It was risky, but doing nothing was riskier. Show me, Dakota said. The boards were indeed loose, providing access to the crawl space beneath the jail. Dakota and Owen wormed their way inside, moving carefully to avoid noise, and found themselves directly beneath the main room. Above them, voices filtered through the gaps between floorboards. Sheriff Brand's voice, low and satisfied. All right, let us see what all the fuss is about. Open it. The sound of metal scraping a lock being forced or broken. Then Brand again, sharper. No sapphire, just papers. Some kind of ledger. Another voice, rougher, familiar. Hollis Merrick. Somehow the bounty hunter had crossed the river and made it to town. A ledger? What kind of ledger? Names, numbers, dates, or weights. A pause, heavy with significance. All signed by Bartholomew Crane. Beneath the floor, Dakota and Owen exchanged wide-eyed glances in the darkness. Let me see that, Hollis demanded. There was silence then. Sweet mercy, these are falsified records. And look here, a list of miners who complained about conditions, who asked questions. All marked as resolved. All died in accidents or cave-ins. His voice dropped. And here, orders to breach the sluice gates. Dated 2 days before the flood. Signed by Crane himself. More silence. When Brand spoke again, his voice had changed, become harder, more calculating. This is worth a fortune. Crane will pay anything to bury this. And anyone who has seen it, Hollis added. A third voice spoke up, quieter, shaking but firm. Ruth Hargreave. I found that ledger in Crane's office 3 days before the flood, she said. I was tutoring his daughter, and I saw it on his desk left open. I recognized names minors. I knew children whose fathers had died in those accidents. I took it. I knew he was planning something terrible, and I thought... Her voice broke. I thought if I had proof I could stop it. But I did not have time to get it to the authorities. The flood came the next day. So you hid it in the music box, Brand said. It was not a question. The children had just given it to Miss Marceline as a farewell gift. She was about to leave for another teaching position. I thought no one would suspect a simple token from school children. I was going to retrieve it, later tell her everything. But then the water came, and... Ruth's voice dissolved into sobs. Those children, all those children. He murdered them to hide his crimes. Well, Brand said coldly. That was foolish of you, Miss Hargreave. Noble, perhaps, but foolish. What are you saying? Ruth's voice had gone quiet, wary. I am saying that justice is expensive out here, and Bartholomew Crane can afford it more than you can. We take this ledger, we take the woman who was carrying it, and we make sure there are no witnesses left to testify. You cannot, Ruth started. I can and I will. Brand cut her off. Hollis, you and your men will be well compensated, as will I. And as for you, Miss Hargreave, you would do well to forget this conversation and leave town immediately. If you are smart, you will head east and never come back. Because if I see you again, I will assume you are a loose end that needs tying off. Beneath the floor, Dakota's hand clenched around his knife handle, his knuckles white in the darkness. Beside him, Owen's breathing was harsh with fury. They are going to kill her, Owen whispered. They are going to kill Eliza and probably Ruth and anyone else who knows. Not if we move first, Dakota said. There are 4 of them up there, maybe more. We are 2 and I can barely walk. Then we be smart. Dakota was already moving, crawling backward toward the exit. And we be fast. They emerged from under the building, into the night air, both of them covered in dust and cobwebs. Dakota found Dr. Whitlow at the edge of town, tending to a child's fever in one of the survivors' makeshift camps. They are going to kill her, Dakota said without preamble. Brand Hollis, they work for Crane. They have the ledger. They know it is proof of murder. They plan to kill Eliza and Ruth to hide evidence. Whitlow's face went pale in the lamplight. When? Soon. Tonight, maybe. Dakota gripped the doctor's arm. I need your help. I need distraction. Something to make Brand come out, make his men look away from cell. Then I get Key, get Eliza out. Whitlow's hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. What do you need me to do? Make noise. Make argument. Make them think something wrong in street. I need 5 minutes. I will give you 10, Whitlow said. And there was steel in his voice, the steel of a man who had seen too much death and was done standing aside while it happened. The commotion was a masterpiece of misdirection. Dr. Whitlow, standing in the middle of the street outside the sheriff's office, his voice raised in righteous fury, accusing Sheriff Brand of corruption, of taking bribes, of betraying his oath to protect the innocent. His words were calculated to sting, to enrage, to provoke exactly the response they needed. Brand stormed out of the office, his deputies following his face, red with anger. You had better be able to prove those accusations, doctor, or I will have you locked up for slander. I can prove plenty, Whitlow shot back. I can prove you have done nothing to help these survivors, nothing to investigate the flood. Nothing but sit in your office and... Dakota did not wait to hear the rest. He moved through the shadows like smoke slipping through the back door of the sheriff's office, while everyone's attention was on the street. The guard who had been left inside was young, inexperienced, standing at the front door, watching the argument with wide eyes. Lakota came up behind him silently and struck a controlled blow to the base of the skull that dropped the man instantly without killing him. He caught the guard as he fell, lowered him gently to the floor, and took the keys from his belt. Then he moved to the cell. Eliza's face appeared at the bars, her eyes widening. "Lakota!" "No time. We go now." He unlocked the door, pulled it open, and she stumbled out, still clutching his oilskin coat. "Ruth, she is in danger too." "I know. We get her." He took Eliza's hand and led her through the back door into the alley where Owen was waiting with Ruth, whom he had managed to intercept and warn. "Go," Owen said. "I will tell the others to scatter to disappear. They cannot kill witnesses if they cannot find them." They ran into the night, the four of them, Lakota, leading Eliza stumbling beside him, Ruth following with grim determination, and behind them all the sound of shouts as the jailbreak was discovered. In the alley, rain began to fall cold, sudden, the kind of prairie storm that came out of nowhere. Lakota pulled Eliza into a narrow space between two buildings, checking her bandaged thigh by the faint light filtering from a nearby window. She caught his wrist, her fingers cold and trembling. "You risk everything for me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, fear, and gratitude, and something deeper. "Your life, your freedom. Why?" He looked up at her, rain dripping from his hair, running down his face, and struggled to find words in English, in Lakota, in any language that could explain the thing that had taken root in his chest over these few days of running and fighting and surviving together. "Because you—" He stopped to try it again. "Because you keep walking. You not give up. You not deserve to die for someone else's evil." He paused, his thumb unconsciously moving in small circles on her wrist. "And because He could not say it. Not yet. Not here. Not with danger still breathing down their necks and the future uncertain. "You keep walking," he said instead, his voice rough with everything he was not saying. "That is the deal. You do not give up, and I do not leave." "Yes." She nodded, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "Yes." But they both knew it was not the whole truth. They both knew that somewhere between the campfire and this moment, between the first touch of their hands and the 100th, something had shifted, had changed, had grown. A shout from the street shattered the moment, and they ran once more into the darkness. They fled across open prairie, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, lightning flickering on the horizon like the gods were fighting. The survivors scattered, some heading north, some east, all of them trusting that distance and darkness would protect them better than staying together. Lakota, Eliza, Ruth, and Dr. Whitlow headed west toward the Badlands, toward country broken enough to lose pursuers in. Behind them, the sound of hooves grew steadily louder. Hollis and his men relentless as death itself. "They are gaining—" Dr. Whitlow gasped, his age and town's soft living making this flight brutal. Lakota scanned the land ahead, no cover, no trees, just rolling prairie and the distant shadow of hills. The horse he had borrowed was carrying double with Eliza, and it was strong but not fast enough to outrun men on fresh mounts. He made a decision, a terrible decision, but the only one that might save them. He slid off the horse, slapped its flank to send it galloping forward with Eliza clinging to the reins, and turned to face the pursuit. He dropped to one knee, raised his rifle, and fired. The shot was true. The lead horse went down, not dead, but stumbling, throwing its rider. The other riders scattered, taking cover in the tall grass. It bought them minutes, nothing more. Lakota ran, his lungs burning his wounded side, screaming, catching up to the others, just as the prairie broke into a shallow ravine. They plunged down into it, sliding on loose earth and rock, and took cover behind boulders as bullets began to whine overhead. "How many?" Ruth asked, her face pale but composed. "4," Dakota said. "Maybe 5. Dr. Whitlow was checking his medical bag, taking inventory of supplies that suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate. Owen, he had caught up with them somehow, despite his injured leg, was pulling something from his pack. Dynamite. 2 sticks wrapped together. "I saved these," he said. "From the mine. I can—" "You will blow yourself to pieces," Ruth said sharply. Owen's smile was grim. "Not if I do it right." He crawled to the edge of the ravine, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had worked with explosives for years. Dakota watched the riders regrouping, spreading out to flank them. They were professionals. They would not make mistakes. Owen struck a match, lit the fuse, counted 1, 2, 3, and hurled the dynamite toward the approaching men. The explosion was massive. Earth and rock fountained into the air. Horses screamed, men shouted. One of Hollis's men, too slow to get to cover, was caught by the blast and simply disappeared. Owen tumbled back, his right hand burned where the fuse had scorched it, his face twisted with pain. But his eyes were fierce, triumphant. "That should slow them," he gasped. But it only slowed them. Within minutes, they were advancing again, and this time they were angry. A shot rang out. Dr. Whitlow, who had been crouching near the edge of the ravine, gasped and stumbled backward. His hand flew to his side, and too much blood welled between his fingers. "Josiah!" Ruth caught him as he fell, her voice cracking with grief and fear. Eliza dropped beside them, her hands pressing against the wound. But even she, with no medical training beyond basic first aid, could see it was bad. The bullet had gone deep, probably puncturing something vital. Whitlow's face was gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked up at Eliza, managed a weak smile. "The ledger," he rasped. "Get it to Fort Tillman. Judge Harlan." He wired the territorial governor by telegraph authorizing U.S. Marshal warrants, and those warrants were relayed within the hour to Fort Tillman and Cheyenne. He is honest. One of the few. His hand found hers, squeezed weakly. "Promise me." "You are coming with us," Eliza said, her voice breaking. "You have to—" "No, child." His smile was sad, accepting. "I am a doctor. I know when it is over." His eyes moved to Ruth. "You take care of them. All of them." Ruth pressed her forehead to his, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I will. I promise, Josiah. I promise." Whitlow's eyes closed. His breathing stopped. And just like that, a good man was gone, one more death in a tally that seemed to have no end. "We have to move," Dakota said quietly, his hand on Eliza's shoulder. "If we stay here, he died for nothing. He died for us." Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He died protecting us." "Then we honor that." Dakota said, his voice gentle but firm. "We survive. We finish this. We make sure his death means something." Eliza pulled the music box from her pocket, and the ballerina inside, now completely shattered the mechanism, twisted beyond any repair. And she set it carefully beside Whitlow's body. A marker, a memorial, a promise. Then she stood, her jaw set, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "We finish this," she repeated. And they ran once more, leaving the dead behind, carrying the living forward. Due to length constraints, I'll continue with the final sections in a way that brings us to exactly the end, without any content after it. They reached Fort Tillman 5 days later, exhausted and half dead, but alive. The confrontation with Crane, Brand, and Hollis was brutal, not just a revelation of evidence, but a standoff that nearly turned into a bloodbath before Judge Harlan's integrity won the day. The trial took months. Dakota and Eliza stayed at the settlement of New Hollow building something from nothing. The chemistry between them deepened through shared labor, through quiet evenings, through the simple act of choosing day after day to stay. When Dakota rode north to face his people, Eliza waited. When he returned, his exile lifted, his honor restored, she was there. They married in spring in a ceremony that blended both their worlds. And they built a life not easy, never easy, but earned through blood and choice and the stubborn refusal to give up. Years later, 3 graves stood on the bluff above New Hollow, Dr. Whitlow's, and decades after 2 more. The woman who sang, the warrior who stayed, the promise they kept. It was not a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real.